You are in violation, and I will not stand for it.
How dare you come onto my ranch and tell me what to do?
The handcuffs clicked shut on Genevieve Blackwell's wrists in front of 200 wealthy homeowners who'd spent 2 decades treating her like royalty. Her face went from tanned perfection to ash white as the investigator read her rights. Embezzlement, fraud, forgery, $250,000 stolen from the community she swore to protect. 3 weeks earlier, this woman tried to fine me $500 for parking on HOA property. She called me a squatter, a liar, an extortionist trying to ruin her perfect lakeside paradise. She had no idea I was a forensic property appraiser who'd just discovered her $1 million clubhouse was sitting on my 3,200 acres land my family had owned since before her HOA even existed. That 1965 survey map she dismissed as a dusty old piece of paper, it proved she'd forged my dead uncle's signature to extend fake easement that expired a decade ago. She thought I was some confused heir who'd fold. It's under pressure. She was about to learn what happens when you steal from someone who reads property law like a combat manual. This is how I dismantled a 20-year empire of fraud. One forged document at a time, but let me start from the beginning. Before we dive into, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. And don't forget to hit the like and subscribe buttons for more interesting stories just like this. Manila envelope sat on my desk like a time bomb wrapped in legal tape, 7 months of probate court, endless paperwork, and attorney fees that could have bought a decent car all to finalize what my Uncle Silas left behind when he died alone in that cabin up north. Deed, Sen, Lambay Acres, Vance Lake Ranch, mine. Every blade of grass, every pine tree, every drop of water in that lake transferred from a man who'd spent 40 years guarding his privacy like it was a military installation. I'd visited him maybe twice as a kid, remembered him as quiet and stubborn. He's the kind of guy who preferred deer to people. Now I understood why. I unfolded the survey map that came with the deed, an original from 1965, yellowed edges, hand-drawn boundary lines, and faded red ink. As a professional property appraiser, I've spent 15 years staring at documents like this for high-stakes clients who pay me to find the cracks in million-dollar deals. Know how to spot an inconsistency before it becomes a lawsuit. This map had a big one, the eastern boundary. Where the ranch met the main road didn't match the modern satellite imagery I pulled up on my laptop. On the satellite view, there was a massive luxury development called Lakeside Estates, all manicured lawns and beige mansions pressed right up against the water. But according to the 1965 survey, that development was sitting on my land, not close to the line, not in a gray area, on my property. I leaned closer, tracing the boundary with my finger. The clubhouse, some white columned monstrosity that looked like a country club, was at least 20% over the line. The gated entrance? Mine, 20 lakefront homes. Also mine. They'd built an entire kingdom of luxury on land they didn't own, and somehow nobody had noticed for decades. I cross-referenced every database I had access to county records, historical land grants, tax assessments, for hours. Later, the conclusion was undeniable. The Lakeside Estates HOA had been squatting on my family's land for over 20 years. And here's the kicker. Uncle Silas had been paying property taxes on the full 3,200 acres the entire time, even while they built tennis courts and walking trails. On his soil, he'd subsidized their lifestyle while they probably laughed about the crazy old hermit. In the cabin, there was no recorded easement, no land swap agreement, no legal justification for any of it, just arrogance and the assumption that nobody would ever check the original deed. I pulled up the HOA's website. The president's name was everywhere. Genevieve Blackwell. Every newsletter. Every community announcement. Every aggressive email about standards and violations had her signature at the bottom. She ran that place like a dictatorship, publicly shaming residents for unpainted fences and unauthorized mailbox colors. I could already tell our first meeting was going to be a collision. I packed my surveying equipment, a high-resolution camera, and the original deed into my truck, and started the 3-hour drive north. The transition from highway to rural roads felt like driving into a different era, less glass, more trees. Air that actually smelled like something other than exhaust. I hit the outskirts of Lakeside Estates first. The contrast was jarring. Perfectly manicured lawns, identical beige mansions, streets so clean they looked photoshopped. It was the kind of place where a single unpainted board was treated like a war crime. I followed the road toward the eastern edge, where the development met the forest, parked on the gravel shoulder, and stepped out with Uncle Silas's 1965 map in hand. The first sign of trouble was a bright white vinyl fence running deep into the woods. According to the map, that fence was sitting 500 feet inside my property line, cutting off a massive section of forest. They hadn't just built a clubhouse, they'd stolen a chunk of my inheritance and turned it into their private hiking trails. Started taking photographs, permanent structures, paved walking paths, decorative lampposts that had no business being on ranch land. Each click of the camera felt like loading ammunition for the lawsuit. I could already see coming. I was setting up my laser distance meter when I heard the high-pitched whine of an electric motor. A white security golf cart pulled up, driven by a kid in his 20s wearing a uniform that looked like it came from a Halloween store. He hopped out, hand resting on his radio like he was SWAT. "You're trespassing on private HOA grounds," he said, puffing his chest out. "Pack it up before I call the cops." I looked at his toy badge, then back at him. "I'm Alistair Vance," I said, keeping my voice calm, "owner of the 3,200 acres surrounding this valley. I'm conducting a private survey of my land in. You're standing on it right now." He laughed short, condescending, the sound of someone who'd never been told no in his life. "The Blackwell family's run this lake for 20 years, he shot back. "So I think they know where their property line is. You've got 10 minutes to move that truck, or I'm calling the president tanned. She's not going to be as nice as I'm being." I smiled. "Calling the president is exactly what I'm hoping you'll do." He stared at me for a second, then grabbed his radio and started yelling into it while I went back to recording GPS coordinates. 10 minutes later, a black Mercedes SUV came tearing around the corner, skidding to a stop inches from my bumper and kicking up a cloud of dust. The door opened, and out stepped Genevieve Blackwell, crisp white blazer, designer sunglasses, gold-trimmed tablet clutched like a royal scepter. She didn't look at the land, the trees, or the lake. She looked at me like I was a stain on her white carpet. "I'm Genevieve Blackwell, president of the Lakeside Estates Homeowners Association," she announced, voice dripping with practiced superiority. "I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing in our maintenance zone, but you're about to find out how expensive it is to cross me." I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the deed. "Actually, Mrs. Blackwell," I said, handing her the document, "I think you'll find that crossing me is significantly more expensive." She glanced at the paper and crumpled it in her manicured hand without reading it. Her jaw tightened as she stepped into my personal space. "You're just another little man trying to extort a successful community," she spat. "This is over by dinner time." I watched her climb back into her SUV and peel out, leaving the security guard standing there looking confused. I went back to my measurements, marking the exact coordinates where her clubhouse crossed onto my land. By the time the sun set behind the pines, I documented 14 separate encroachments, photographed 6 permanent structures, and confirmed what I already knew. Genevieve Blackwell had built her empire on stolen ground, and she had no idea. The earthquake was coming. I spent my first night in Uncle Silas's cabin, solid structure of cedar and stone that smelled like old leather and wood smoke. The 1965 map was pinned to a board by the fireplace. I sat there studying every boundary marker, every notation, every piece of evidence that would hold up in court. Uncle Silas hadn't been a hermit. He'd been a strategist, quietly paying taxes and waiting for someone to finally call their bluff. Morning came with the invasive drone of industrial leaf blowers from the HOA side of the boundary. I walked onto the porch with coffee, watching an army of landscapers groom the common areas into unnatural perfection. On my side, Wild ferns and pine needles, nature doing what it does, on theirs. Chemical green grass forced into rigid submission. That's when I saw the clubhouse and the distance white pillars gleaming like a plantation house dropped into the mountains. A monument to manufactured entitlement, sitting 20% on land they didn't own. I was halfway through my second cup when the golf cart returned. Carrying Genevieve and two older men in matching polo shirts, she climbed out holding a bright orange clipboard like it was a weapon. "Mr. Vance, I presume you've reconsidered your little stunt yesterday?" she called out, walking toward my gate with forced confidence. "This is a formal violation notice from the Lakeside Estates HOA regarding your vehicle and this unsightly structure." She tore off a yellow slip and held it out. $500 fine. For aesthetic noncompliance, the two men behind her nodded like they were presiding over a trial. I took the paper, glanced at it, then looked back at her. "Mrs. Blackwell, this ranch isn't part of your association," I said. "Your bylaws have no standing here. I'd appreciate it if you and your board step back onto your own property before I call the sheriff." She laughed sharp. Brittle, unhinged. "You're delusional if you think you can ruin property values in this valley," she hissed. "The Lakeside Estates Master Covenant says all surrounding parcels within a 1-mile radius are subject to our standards. We have a maintenance zone easement, and we will not allow this cabin to devalue our residents' multi-million-dollar investments." I looked past her toward the clubhouse, mentally overlaying the boundary lines I'd memorized. "Tell me, Genevieve," I said, using her first name just to needle her, "who authorized construction of that clubhouse back in 1998? She bristled. "That building was approved by the county and the board unanimously," she snapped. I smiled. "Interesting. Because according to my deed, 20% of that building is sitting on Vance Ranch soil land. I never gave you permission to build." The two men behind her shifted uncomfortably. Her face turned blotchy red. "You're a liar and a common extortionist," she spat. "My legal team will file an injunction by end of business today." She marched back to her cart, leaving the crumpled violation notice in the dirt. I didn't pick it up. I just went back to my surveying equipment and kept working. Over the next 4 hours, I trekked through the brush, documenting every violation. I found where they diverted a natural stream for a decorative waterfall on their 10th hole probable state environmental violation. Found irrigation lines running across my land without permission. I found paved trails, benches, lampposts, millions of dollars in improvements built on property they didn't own. By afternoon, I had enough evidence to bankrupt the HOA 10 times. I sat down at my laptop and drafted a formal notice to vacate and restore. Citing the 1965 survey and the complete absence of recorded easements, this wasn't about a $500 fine anymore. This was about reclaiming dignity for the land. For my family, for Uncle Silas, I knew the next few days would bring threats, smears, maybe worse. But Genevieve had forgotten one simple rule of high-stakes real estate. Never build your throne on someone else's land, especially when that owner knows the law. The next morning, I woke to the sound of heavy machinery. A commercial brush hog sat idling 20 feet from my gate, engine vibrating through the cabin floor. Behind it, a dump truck and 4 men in orange vests, unloading pallets of sod and decorative river rock. It was a full-scale invasion disguised as a landscaping project. I walked down the steps, boots crunching on dry pine needles, and stopped directly. In front of the loader, the foreman killed the engine and climbed down, annoyed. "You're trespassing on private property," I said, voice projecting over the dying roar. "I'm Alistair Vance, owner of this ranch. Remove your equipment and your crew immediately." He looked at his clipboard, then back at me. "Lady in the white." "SUV Mrs. Blackwell told us this was a maintenance zone cleanup," he said. Said the owner was some eccentric relative who wouldn't mind us tidying up. "We've got a contract to level this brush and clear the sightline for residents on the hill." A calculated lie to create a fait accompli toward the land first. Make restoration harder in court later. I pulled out my phone and dialed my attorney, Julian Reed, putting it on speaker so the foreman could hear. "Julian, I've got a crew on the property trying to level the forest for the HOA. I need the county sheriff here immediately for active trespass. Julian didn't hesitate. I'm drafting the emergency stay now. Sheriff Thorne will be there in 20 minutes. Foreman's face shifted from indifference to concern. We don't want any part of a legal dispute, man, he muttered, signaling his crew to stop unloading. That's when Genevieve's black SUV came tearing down the road. Skidding to a halt in a cloud of red dust, she jumped out, face contorted with rage. What is the meaning of this work stoppage? She screamed. I'm paying this crew $3,000 a day to bring this eyesore up to community standards, and you have no right to interfere. I stood between her and the equipment. Genevieve, I told you, yesterday, your jurisdiction ends at the fence line, I said. This is a 3,200-acre private ranch. Every foot of soil your machines disturb will result in a separate civil suit. She laughs, sharp, brittle, unhinged. Robert Thorne is a personal friend of my family, she shot back. He's not going to arrest me for improving a patch of dirt you probably haven't even paid inheritance taxes on yet, you parasite. Classic intimidation. Weaponized local connections. To bypass legal reality, I just checked my watch, right on cue. A white patrol car with the county star on the door pulled up. Lights flashing, Sheriff Robert Thorne stepped out tall, graying. Weary expression that said he'd dealt with Genevieve's emergencies too many times. He looked at the machinery. The pallets, the 1965 survey map I'd laid on my truck hood. He didn't say a word to Genevieve until he'd examined the documents. Mrs. Blackwell, I'm going to need your boys to pack it up and move back to the clubhouse side of the line, he said, voice a low rumble. Genevieve gasped, mouth hanging open in genuine shock. Robert, surely you aren't listening to this man. He's an outsider who just showed up yesterday with some dusty old map. Thorne looked at the deed, which bore the official county seal and my attorney's firm stamp. The map might be dusty, Genevieve, but it matches the records in the county office, he said. Until a judge tells me otherwise, this man is the owner of record and you're trespassing. The humiliation on her face was absolute, a deep crimson flush spreading from neck to forehead. She pointed a trembling finger at the crew. Fine, pack it up. But don't think for 1 second this is over, Mr. Vance, she spat. And we'll be discussing your encroachment on our lake access. She climbed back into her SUV and sped away, leaving the crew. To frantically reload under Sheriff Thorne's watchful eye, Thorne walked over to me after the machines were gone. Keep your gates locked and your cameras recording, he said quietly. I thanked him, knowing the first layer of physical intimidation had been neutralized. But Genevieve wouldn't stop here. Now she'd pivot to social destruction that afternoon. Set up high-definition trail cameras along the entire boundary line for K-resolution. Motion activated, cloud backup. Any further incursions would be captured and stored as evidence. I also marked the 19th century cornerstones from the 1965 survey with bright orange paint, reinforcing my claim on every disputed inch. I wasn't just an appraiser anymore. I was a surveyor, historian, a guardian of a legacy the HOA had spent 20 years trying to erase. By evening, my phone started blowing up with notifications. The Lakeside Estates Community Forum, a private group, Genevieve moderated, was exploding with posts about a dangerous squatter at the ranch. Photos of my truck, my cabin, even a blurred image of me near the gate, accompanied by warnings to keep children away. This was the second wave of her attack. Weaponizing community fear and property value obsession, they were building a narrative where I was the villain in their manicured fairy tale. Saved every comment and post as evidence of coordinated harassment by the board. Then I did something calculated. I found the name Martha Higgins in the HOA's public tax filings, the treasurer who dissented in the last 3 board meetings. I drafted a polite, professional email to her, attaching the 1965 survey and Julian Reed's letter of representation. I didn't ask for favors, I just provided facts. Genevieve was likely withholding from the rest of the board. I wanted her to see the liability sitting on their books, a clubhouse that was 20% on my land. That night, Lone car drove slowly past my gate, headlights scanning the trees before turning around. The harassment was escalating, but as I closed my eyes, I felt something Genevieve could never touch. The truth. The law. And 3,200 acres of leverage she hadn't accounted for. The war for Vance. Lake Ranch was no longer a quiet dispute. It was a public explosion, and I was the one holding the fuse. The county recorder's office smelled like old paper, floor wax, and bureaucratic indifference. I spent 5 days in the basement, navigating shelves of massive leather-bound ledgers, hunting for the 1965 master easement Genevieve claimed gave the HOA authority over my hillsides. Most people would have been intimidated by the sheer volume of microfilm and handwritten indices. I found it comforting as a professional appraiser. I knew that every modern conflict had its roots in an old piece of paper tucked in a forgotten drawer. I finally located the Vance Ranch file, pulse quickening as I pulled the yellowed documents from their acid-free sleeve. The original 1965 deed was accompanied by a temporary usage agreement. Not permanent. Temporary. Duration. 40 years. According to the document, the rights to maintain the Vusht and access eastern trails were set to expire precisely 10 years ago. On the anniversary of the 1965 grant, I flipped to the back, expecting a legitimate extension signed by Uncle Silas. What I found was a crude forgery. The signature on the 1995 renewal didn't match the shaky, methodical handwriting I knew from Silas's personal letters and probate papers. It was a bold, cursive flourish that looked suspiciously similar to the signatures on the HOA's current corporate bank accounts. Genevieve. Blackwell hadn't just overstepped her authority. She'd committed felony forgery by faking my uncle's signature to keep her community's access to my private lake. I made high-resolution scans of every page, feeling the evidence solidify in my hands. This wasn't a boundary dispute anymore. This was organized fraud. But I didn't stop at paper trails. I needed modern proof to match the historical evidence. I hired a specialized firm from the city to conduct a full-scale drone survey and LiDAR mapping of the entire 3,200 acres. For 3 days, high-end quadcopters hummed over the lake and forest, capturing billions of data points to create a perfect 3D model of the ranch. We overlaid the 1965 boundary lines onto modern topography, revealing the exact coordinates of every HOA encroachment. The results were damning. Clubhouse dining terrace, 32 feet inside my property line, irrigation pump house, entirely on my land walking trails, 500 plus feet of encroachment. But the LiDAR revealed something even worse. A topographical depression where the HOA is drainage. System terminated pipe dumping runoff directly into a federally protected wetland. On my property, I cross-referenced the coordinates with EPA maps. The wetland was classified as critical habitat under the Clean Water Act. Penalty for unauthorized discharge. $50,000 per day? Genevieve hadn't just stolen my land. She'd been committing federal, environmental crimes for years. I documented everything, added it to the growing dossier, and kept digging. 3 days later, I got the email I'd been waiting for, from Martha Higgins' subject. We need to talk. She wanted to meet in person alone. Off HOA property. We agreed on a diner 30 miles outside the valley. Far enough that Genevieve's spies wouldn't spot us. Martha arrived looking exhausted, carrying a thick folder and glancing over her shoulder like she was being followed. She slid into the booth across from me, hand shaking slightly as she opened the folder. Mr. Vance, I've been the HOA treasurer for 8 years, she said quietly. And I've been watching Genevieve manipulate the books for most of that time. I didn't have proof until you sent me that survey. She spread financial documents across the table. There's a recurring payment to a shell company called Lakeview Management Solutions, she said. It coincides exactly with the clubhouse construction. In 1998, I traced the company. It's owned by Genevieve's brother. My pulse spiked. How much? I asked. $250,000 over 20 years, she said. siphoned from special assessments and maintenance fees. She's been embezzling from the community while pretending to protect it. I leaned back, processing the scale of the fraud. Genevieve hadn't just stolen my land, she'd stolen from her own community to cover up the theft. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Martha looked me in the eye. "'Cause I'm tired of being complicit," she said. "And because you're the only person with the power to stop her?" She handed me copies of bank statements, invoices, board meeting minutes, everything I needed to prove financial fraud alongside property theft. "There's an annual HOA meeting in 2 weeks," she said. "Every homeowner will be there. If you're going to take her down, that's your moment." I thanked her, promising to keep her involvement confidential until the right time. As she left, I sat in that diner booth staring at the financial records, realizing the trap was no longer just set. It was armed, triggered, and waiting for Genevieve to walk into it. Back at the cabin, I organized everything into a comprehensive legal dossier. 1965 survey proving encroachment, forged 1995 easement extension LiDAR. Mapping showing exact violations, federal, environmental crimes, wetland contamination, $250,000 embezzlement with bank records, coordinated harassment evidence, forum posts, fake fines. I sent the full package to Julian Reed and requested he coordinate with the district attorney's office and EPA enforcement. This wasn't just a civil lawsuit anymore. This was a criminal case with federal implications. Julian called back. An hour later, "Alistair, this is beyond what I expected," he said, voice tight with professional excitement. "The DA wants to move forward with charges. EPA's opening an investigation. And the civil case, we're not just winning, we're destroying her good," I said, "because in 2 weeks, she's going to find out exactly what she stole." I stood on the porch that night, watching the lights of the mansions across the water, knowing that every single one of those homeowners was about to learn they'd been lied to, stolen from, and used as pawns in Genevieve's empire of fraud. The silence before the storm had ended. Tomorrow, the trap snaps. The morning of the reckoning started quietly. Too quietly. I was sitting on the porch with coffee when I heard tires on gravel slow, deliberate, like someone trying to decide whether to commit. A sedan pulled up to my gate, followed by a man in a cheap suit holding a manila envelope. Process server. He walked toward me with the rehearsed confidence of someone who'd done this 1,000 times, handed me the envelope, and left without a word. I opened it. Lakeside Estates, HOA. Fees. Alistair, advanced defamation, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress. Genevieve was suing me. I almost laughed. She'd filed a lawsuit claiming I was spreading malicious lies about the HOA's authority, damaging property values, and causing residents severe emotional distress. With my threatening presence, it was a desperation move, a preemptive strike designed to paint me as the aggressor before the truth came out. I called Julian Reed. "She just served me with a defamation suit," I said. Julian snorted. "Of course she did. Classic slap tactics, sue the whistleblower to drain their resources and scare them into silence," he said. "Don't worry, we'll countersue for malicious prosecution, and when the criminal charges drop, her case evaporates." 8. "How long until the da moves?" I asked. 2 days, Julian said. "They're finalizing the warrant now. Fraud, forgery, embezzlement. She's looking at 5 years minimum if convicted." "And the HOA meeting, still on for Saturday night?" "The DAS office is coordinating. With me, they'll have investigators there when you present the evidence. It's going to be dramatic." I hung up and looked at the lawsuit in my hands, Genevieve thought. This was her checkmate. She had no idea she was handing me more evidence of harassment for the countersuit. That afternoon, Genevieve made her boldest move yet. Her black SUV pulled up to my gate, not alone this time, followed by a news van from the local station. She climbed out wearing a crisp white suit, its perfectly styled hair, holding a microphone like she was about to deliver a State of the Union address. Reporter followed her, camera rolling. I stayed on the porch, arms crossed, watching the performance unfold. "This man," Genevieve said, pointing at me with theatrical outrage, has been terrorizing our community for weeks. Trespassing on HOA property, threatening residents, spreading vicious lies about our leadership. We've tried to resolve this peacefully, but he's left us no choice but to pursue legal action to protect our families. The reporter ate it up, nodding sympathetically as Genevieve painted herself as the victim. I waited until she finished, then walked down to the gate with the 1965 survey map and the forged easement extension in hand. "Mrs. Blackwell," I called out loud enough for the camera to catch, "would you like to explain to your community why you forged my uncle's signature on this document to extend an easement that expired 10 years ago?" I held up the comparison Silas's real signature next to the crude forgery. Genevieve's face went white. That's a baseless accusation," she stammered. "Would you also like to explain the $250,000 you embezzled from HOA funds and funneled to your brother's shell company?" I continued, pulling out Martha's financial records. The reporter's eyes went wide. Genevieve lunged toward me, trying to grab the documents. "Turn that camera off," she screamed at the reporter. "This is private property. You're trespassing." "Actually," I said calmly, "you're standing on my property right now." "Is that?" I gestured to the camera, is all going to be very useful. Evidence in about 48 hours, her attorneyhood, been standing silently by the SUV, finally intervened, pulling Genevieve back toward the vehicle. "No further comment," he said to the reporter, practically shoving Genevieve into the passenger seat. The news van left. Genevieve's SUV sped away, and I stood there with my evidence, knowing that performance just made everything worse for her. Saturday night arrived. The Lakeside Estates annual HOA meeting was held in the clubhouse, the same building, sitting 20% on my land. 200 homeowners packed the room, dressed in business casual, clutching wine glasses, and looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. I walked in wearing jeans, boots, and a flannel shirt. Carrying a leather briefcase, every head turned, whispers rippled through the crowd. "That's him, the squatter. Is he allowed to be here?" Genevieve sat at the head table with the remaining board members, her face a mask of forced calm. She saw me and stood abruptly. "Mr. Vance, this is a private meeting for association members only," she announced. "You need to leave immediately." Smiled and gestured toward the back of the room. 2 investigators from the district attorney's office stepped through the door, badges visible.
Genevieve's face went from red to gray in seconds. "Actually, Mrs. Blackwell," I said, "I'm here to present evidence of fraud, forgery, and embezzlement that affects every homeowner in this room. And these investigators are here to ensure you don't destroy any more documents." The room went dead silent. I walked to the front, connected my laptop to the projector, and pulled up the presentation I'd spent a week preparing. Slide 1, the 1965 survey. This is the original boundary map for Vance Lake Ranch. As you can see, the clubhouse you're sitting in right now is partially built on land my family has owned for 3 generations. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Slide 2, the forged easement. This is the document Mrs. Blackwell used to justify HOA access to my property. Notice the signature. It doesn't match my uncle's handwriting. Because she forged it. Genevieve shot to her feet. "This is slander. I'll have you arrested for." One of the investigators raised a hand. "Mrs. Blackwell, please sit down," he said calmly. "We'll need to speak with you after this presentation." She sat, trembling. Slide 3, the LiDAR map. This is a 3D scan of the property showing every structure built on land you don't own. Clubhouse terrace, irrigation systems, walking trails, millions of dollars in improvements on stolen property. Slide 4, the financial records. And this is where it gets criminal. Mrs. Blackwell has been siphoning HOA funds, $250,000 over 20 years, to a shell company owned by her brother. I displayed the bank statements, the invoices, the shell company registration. The room erupted. Homeowners shouted questions, demanded answers, turned on Genevieve with fury. Martha Higgins stood from her seat. "I can confirm every financial record Mr. Vance just presented," she said, voice shaking but steady. I've been trying to get the board to investigate for years. Mrs. Blackwell blocked every attempt. Genevieve looked around wildly, realizing the walls were closing in. "You're all fools," she hissed. "I built this community. I protected your property values. You owe me." "Mrs. Blackwell," one of the investigators said, walking toward her, "we have a warrant for your arrest." He pulled out handcuffs. The room fell silent as the metal clicked shut around her wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," the investigator began, reading her Miranda rights as 200 shocked homeowners watched their queen fall. Genevieve's attorney stood frozen, briefcase in hand, clearly calculating how fast he could distance himself from this disaster. As they led her toward the door, she turned back to glare at me. "This isn't over," she spat. I met her eyes. "Yes, it is." The door closed behind her, and the room exploded into chaos, homeowners shouting, board members resigning on the spot, Martha trying to restore order. I packed up my laptop and walked out into the cool night air, feeling the weight of 3 weeks lift off my shoulders. The war for Vance Lake Ranch was over. Now came the restoration. 4 months later, the first frost settled over the valley. I stood on the porch of Uncle Silas's cabin, my cabin now, watching the sunrise paint the lake in shades of orange and gold. The silence was different now. Not the tense, hostile quiet of a siege, but the peaceful stillness of land finally at rest. Genevieve Blackwell had been sentenced to 5 years in prison. Fraud. Forgery. Embezzlement. Federal environmental violations. Her attorney had tried to negotiate a plea deal, but the evidence was too overwhelming. The judge hadn't been sympathetic to a woman who'd spent 20 years stealing from both her community and a dead man's estate. The HOA was effectively dissolved. Half the board resigned immediately after the meeting. The other half was voted out by furious homeowners who discovered they'd been funding Genevieve's criminal enterprise for decades. Martha Higgins had been elected temporary president, tasked with cleaning up the financial wreckage and negotiating a path forward with me. She'd done it with integrity, something Genevieve never understood. The physical restoration began in late fall. The clubhouse terrace extension, the part sitting 32 feet on my land, was carefully dismantled and removed. I watched the crew work, making sure every piece was documented and disposed of properly. The irrigation pump house was relocated to HOA property, with a proper easement agreement this time, one I'd reviewed, approved, and signed. The walking trails that crossed the boundary were rerouted, marked with clear signage that respected both properties. But the most satisfying moment came when the EPA enforcement team arrived to supervise the removal of the illegal drainage pipe dumping into the protected wetland. The pipe was excavated, the contaminated soil was remediated, and native vegetation was replanted according to federal restoration standards. By spring, the wetland would be thriving again, birds returning, frogs singing, water flowing clean. I'd paid for part of the restoration myself, not because I had to, but because Uncle Silas would have wanted it. The new community council, led by Martha, approached me in December with a proposal. "Mr. Vance," she said, standing at my gate with a small group of homeowners who looked genuinely remorseful. "We'd like to negotiate a voluntary easement for lake access and trail maintenance. Fair compensation, clear boundaries, renewable every 5 years with your approval." I looked at the proposed agreement. It was reasonable. Respectful. Honest. "On one condition," I said. "Every homeowner who uses the trails signs an agreement acknowledging this is Vance family land, held in trust for future generations. No one forgets what happened here." Martha nodded. Agreed. We signed the easement on the porch of the cabin, witnessed by Julian Reed and notarized by a county official. It wasn't a victory, it was a coexistence built on mutual respect instead of theft. One afternoon in early winter, I was repairing a section of fence near the boundary when I heard boots on gravel. I turned to see the security guard who'd threatened me that first day, the kid in the toy uniform who'd told me to pack it up or face consequences. He looked different now. Older. Humbled. Mr. Vance, he said, hat in hands. I wanted to apologize. I was just doing what Mrs. Blackwell told me, but that's no excuse. I was a jerk, and I'm sorry. I studied him for a second, then handed him a hammer. You any good at building fence? I asked. He blinked, surprised. Yeah, actually. My dad taught me. Good. I need help with the northern boundary. Pays $20 an hour, and you get to learn how property law actually works. He smiled, genuine, grateful. Deal. By the end of winter, he was working for me part-time, learning surveying and land management from someone who actually respected the profession. Turned out, he wasn't a bad kid. Just misled by someone who weaponized authority for personal gain. On the coldest morning of the year, I walked down to the shore of the lake where the water lapped gently against mossy rocks. The mansions across the water looked the same, beige, manicured, expensive. But the people living in them had changed. They waved when they saw me now. They asked permission before accessing the trails. They respected the land instead of assuming ownership. Genevieve's empire of entitlement had crumbled, replaced by something quieter and more sustainable. I pulled out the original 1965 survey map, now framed and hanging on the cabin wall, and traced the boundary lines with my finger. Uncle Silas had protected this land for 40 years, waiting for someone with the skills and determination to finally call out the fraud. He'd been patient. Strategic. Right. And now, his legacy was secure. That night, I sat by the fireplace with a glass of whiskey, listening to the wind in the pines. Justice hadn't come from the roar of courtrooms or the flash of handcuffs, though those moments had been satisfying. It had come in the quiet decision to stand my ground when the entire weight of a corrupt system told me to fold. It had come in the meticulous documentation, the late nights researching property law, the refusal to be intimidated by fake authority. It had come in the moment I decided integrity mattered more than 1,000 threats. Genevieve Blackwell had built her throne on stolen land, believing no one would ever challenge her. She'd forgotten one simple truth. You can't fake ownership. You can't forge legacy. And you can't outrun someone who knows the law better than you know your lies. I raised my glass toward the 1965 map on the wall. Here's to you, Uncle Silas, I said quietly. The land is safe. The fraud is exposed. And your legacy lives on. Outside, the lake reflected the stars, ancient, patient, enduring. 3,200 acres. Mine. Protected. Forever.